Good evening. Good evening and welcome both to everybody here in the lecture theatre and also to our online audience as well. Welcome to the British School at Rome and to the third talk in the City of Rome series, a programme of public lectures accompanying the BSR's annual postgraduate course, where students from universities across the UK spend 2 months at the BSR studying the history, archaeology and topography of Rome. I'm Christopher Siwicki, the course director, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Emily Hurt. Emily is an ancient historian whose research focuses primarily on the period of the Roman Republic, covering subjects including conquest, colonization, religion, and numismatics in Italy, Greece, and North Africa. Emily was awarded a PhD in ancient history at the Yale University in 2023, having previously studied modern history at Brown University. Her thesis, Palimpsest: Cities of the Roman Mediterranean, examined how Roman culture was negotiated through the destruction and rebuilding of conquered cities, with case studies in central Italy, namely Falaise and Volsini, as well as in the wider Mediterranean, including Corinth and Carthage. In 2022, Emily held the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Rome Prize Fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. Following this, in 2023, she was the Henry S. Robinson Research Fellow in Corinth at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. Since 2024, Emily has been Assistant Professor of Classical Studies at John Cabot University in Rome. Here she teaches Greek and Roman history and literature, as well as specialist models on colonization, contact and displacement in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the women who built Rome, a topic that seems relevant to tonight's talk. Emily's publications reflect her diverse research interests, and recent contributions to the field include Grieving the Provincial City of Orosius in Studies of Late Antiquity 2024, Rome's Conquest Topography and the Case of Aquae Faliscum in the American Journal of Philology, forthcoming, and the superbly titled The Elephant in the Atrium, Conquest Interpretation and the Image of Calestis in Transactions of the American Philological Association. A book manuscript is also in preparation based on the subject of her PhD thesis. In a recent interview at John Cabot about her work, Emily responds that if I'm not in the classroom, then I'm hiking. It is an attitude which echoes that encapsulated by W.G. Hoskins' sentiment of what a historian needs most is a strong pair of walking boots, something that also this year's City of Rome course participants no doubt appreciate when traversing the unforgiving pavements of Rome. Our title this evening is The Jealousy of Fulvia, Rereading Female Politicians in the Civil Wars. Will you please welcome our speaker, Dr. Emily Hurt.
I realized I should have taken this talk out maybe before stepping up to the podium. So thank you for your patience. Well, thank you so much to the BSR. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Chris. I'll talk to you later about adding 20 years to my age there during the introduction. And thank you to the staff here for organizing the details of my visit today. Women have their uses for historians. They offer relief from warfare, legislation, and the history of ideas. And they enrich the central themes of social history, if and when enough evidence is available. These are the words of Sir Ronald Syme, a legendary scholar of the previous century, an expert on the Roman historiographical tradition and on the complex transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And it's perhaps unfair to malign such an intellectual giant by beginning with this quotation. In his classic work, The Roman Revolution, which outlines in admirable detail and beautiful prose the period that will be under discussion today, that is the middle decades of the 1st century BCE, Syme acknowledged that the women of noble families of Rome held significant power, even if his discussion of this power was relegated to their success as scheming matchmakers for their daughters. Now, before we decide to collectively hate him, I should clarify that Syme was an expert in historiography, on writers like Sallust and Tacitus, on whom he wrote several monographs. And it's true that our ancient sources, by and large, show very little interest in the lives of women. And when they do, the stories do not obviously showcase women's power beyond such scheming. Most lengthy accounts of women come from a later period and lie somewhere in the intersection of fabulous wealth and questionable morals. Our Republican examples tend to be one-dimensional, showcasing moral or feminine virtues. But most accounts of women are mere passing references, easy to skip and difficult to interpret. While Syme is not the worst offender, he's also, sadly to say, not really only a product of his time. He was born in 1903, and he wrote The Roman Revolution, well, it was published in 1939. Even today, interest in the Civil War period is centered on politics, mainly, and the transition from oratorical battles on the floor of the Senate to armed battles on the plains and seas of Rome's territorial empire. In Rome, the holding of magistracies, the passing of laws, the fighting of battles, this was the realm of men, and it's been published as such and studied as such. Today, discussions of Roman women tend to occur in isolation still, specific conferences or panels dedicated to women, academic series or on biographies of women. Classes like my own, which Chris pointed out, taught at John Cabot, on Roman women. At the last conference I was at on the Roman civil wars, for example, over the course of 3 days, only one woman was ever mentioned, and only one time. And this is not entirely our fault, us historians. When we look, for example, at the study of individuals for the decade, let's say, between the death of Julius Caesar in 44 to the Battle of Actium in 31, we can find some 2,000 men. And if we add the previous 400 years, that number just doubles. So we can see how many individuals we know from this time period. Of the more or less than 600 noblemen that made up the Roman Senate when Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49, we can construct something of the names, families, or lives for about 400 of them. So that's a lot of information. But the same search for women yields about 200. And many of these are likely the same person, repeated, or multiple people lumped together. Roman women were named after their fathers' families. Thus, Julius Caesar had a daughter named Julia. Had he had a second, she would have been named the younger Julia. Had he had a third, she would have been called the third Julia, and so on. When women are mentioned, our sources often do us no favors. Most of us will be familiar with the Roman aristocrat of the 1st century BCE, Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony, and his love affair with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra VII. We may be less familiar with the fact that for the majority of his relationship with Cleopatra, Mark Antony was married back in Rome, first to a woman, the subject of this story, named Fulvia, and later, after her death, to the sister of his rival Octavian, a woman named Octavia. So in the winter of 40 BCE, Antony was living with Cleopatra in Alexandria. He was, by all accounts, living his best life in the Ptolemaic court, while continuing to pursue the expansionary and militaristic aims of a Roman imperator. He was, in fact, planning a campaign against the Parthians to the east. So Mark Antony's all set to leave when his wife, Fulvia, writes him a letter. Plutarch, who preserves this story, does not give us the contents of the letter, stating only that it was, quote, full of complaints, and claiming that Fulvia was using her conflict with Antony's rival Octavian back in Italy to draw her husband away from the Egyptian queen. Plutarch's interpretation likely gives us more an insight into his moral stance on the character of Fulvia than any real clue to what the letter said. The project that I'm going to present to you tonight is predicated on just ignoring accounts of the jealousy of Fulvia and reading this and similar stories like this. Fulvia and other Antonine supporters were engaged in a war back in Italy to protect his interests. Things were falling apart. Fulvia updated Antony on the situation, and he abandoned plans for an upcoming Parthian campaign and headed to Italy with a fleet. This is just one of the many examples, many references we have in the Civil War period to women sending letters or acting as messengers themselves in ways that shape the trajectory of history. In the next hour, I'm going to take you through this ongoing project of cataloging these instances and using them to trace the role of women as political actors in some of the most tumultuous years of Roman history. Women, I argue, play vital roles as messengers, as mediators, and most importantly, as gatekeepers of information in the rapidly changing communication network formed between the highly visible and the highly mobile players in the Civil War period. I know I've been told to expect a diverse group here tonight, artists, scholars, some of whom I'm sure are very familiar with this period, others who are perhaps less familiar. So you'll forgive me if I sometimes over-explain, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, big or small, at the end. So the Civil War period is one of the most well-studied and most popularly well-known periods of Roman history. It spans the majority of the 1st century BCE, and it's characterized by a series of conflicts between strong Roman generals who used the project of empire to accrue personal power. Many of these names will be familiar to us, right? Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, Gaius Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian, who, spoiler alert, will later become the Emperor Augustus. My guess would be, if you've heard of any woman from this period, it's only one, the emblematic non-Roman Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, who I didn't include in this study. Each of these men were at the head of extensive and complex senatorial factions. The members of their factions, their movements, their politics, the coins they issued, the armies they commanded, the magistracies they held, have been the subject of exhaustive research over the course of centuries. And until recently, women have been largely invisible in this conversation. Partially, this is a real consequence of the realities of women in Roman life and the constraints they faced. Women in Rome could not hold public office. They did not mint coins. They did not pass laws. They did not lead legions in battle. The written sources from this period of history, and indeed from almost the entirety of Roman history, are almost exclusively written by elite men. As some recent scholarship has illustrated, however, this does not mean that women did not hold some form of political power and that they were not integrally involved in the mechanisms of historical change. Recently, there's been more interest in women, and particularly this late Republican movement, this late Republican moment of what scholars have sometimes called female emancipation. The idea is that the conditions of the late Republic, the political tumult, the mass displacement and killing of senatorial men created new opportunities for women. So it's not a new idea. And I include some, but hardly all of the work on this from the past 5 years or so. And you'll notice that the word power is prominent, power, intervention, right? This is the way in which we're starting to think about women of the late Republic. The increased visibility of women in public in times of crisis was noted even in antiquity. Valerius Maximus, in his 1st century CE Memorable Deeds and Sayings, writes, "What has a woman to do with public assemblies? If the custom of our country be observed, nothing. But when domestic peace and quiet is tossed upon the waves of sedition, the authority of ancient custom gives way, and that which violence compels avails more than what modesty persuades and directs." Now, there's some debate over the form that this participation took and whether it was, apart from a few key examples, restricted to behind-the-scenes activity, private conversations among families in back rooms, where women primarily acted to bridge the gaps between maybe their birth families and the families that they married into. In the late Republic, where balances between political factions were ever more fragile, marriage did play an incredibly important role in maintaining relationships and solidifying political power and connections. Before leaving for Gaul in 58, Caesar gives his daughter Julia in marriage to his political partner turned rival Pompey. And Appian tells us this: "Caesar saw that he would be away from home for a long time, and that envy would be greater in proportion to the greatness of the benefits conferred. And he gave his daughter in marriage to Pompey, even though she was betrothed to Caepio, because he feared that even a friend might become envious of his great success. He also promoted the boldest of his partisans into the principal offices for the ensuing year. He designated his friend Aulus Gabinus as consul, with Lucius Piso as his colleague, whose daughter Calpurnia Caesar married, although Cato cried out that the empire was becoming a mere matrimonial agency." Cato's complaints of the devolution of the Republic into a marriage agency points to a real fear about the power of women to maintain and rupture political connections in ways that were outside of the traditional methods of legislative control held by men. Cato, the staunch Republican, sees this use of women as anathema to the project of republicanism, a way to circumvent the serious operations of the government. And he may have had a point. When Caesar's daughter Julia dies in childbirth, the connection that held Pompey and Caesar together, the tenuous connection, dissolved. And 5 years and much violence later, Pompey's severed head would be presented to Caesar in Egypt. The idea that women were primarily useful for their family connections, traded among elite men for political gain, misdirects, though, the reading of our sources. Cato's own daughter, Portia, was married to 2 prominent members of the conservative, let's call it Republican faction, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus and Marcus Junius Brutus, who was one of the architects of the assassination of Caesar. As the wife of Brutus, Portia is the only woman recorded, at least, to know about the conspiracy to assassinate Caesar. And we get this in this somewhat elaborate and dramatic story that's repeated in Cassius Dio and in Plutarch. Dio tells us that she knew something was happening that preoccupied her husband, and so she tortured herself by stabbing herself in the thigh to show him that she was not physically weak and would reveal no secrets, not even under torture. and she gave a long speech which ends like this. I know that a woman's nature is thought too weak to endure a secret, but good rearing and excellent companionship go far towards strengthening character, and it is my happy lot to be both the daughter of Cato and the wife of Brutus. Before this, I put less confidence in these advantages, but now I know I am superior even to pain. Perhaps more eloquently, we get the sentiment repeated by Shakespeare's Portia. Grant, I am a woman, but withal a woman that Lord Brutus took to wife. Oh my goodness. Do I keep Shakespeare, the power of Shakespeare, my friends? Should I keep going? Okay. It's all very dark out there now. Maybe. But this has been happening recently in my classroom. It might be me. Right? Portia, we missed you. Shakespeare's Portia. Grant, I am a woman, but withal a woman that Lord Brutus took to wife. I'm a woman well reputed, Cato's daughter. Think you I am no stronger than my sex, being so fathered and so husbanded? Though Portia's marriage may have been arranged in accordance with family members, we should hesitate to think she had no say in her marriage prospects, and that she, marrying two prominent Republicans, was not aligning herself to a political agenda. The story tells us a few things. First, she knew her husband was involved in a conspiracy of utmost political intrigue. She was, whether through self-injury or no, made privy to this plot. Our authors present this story as a literary topos that models a type of feminine virtue in which the ability to face pain and death rather than succumb to a sort of female weakness is tied to success of the state. But the original story, told in Plutarch and Cassius Dio, comes from a book, now lost, that Brutus wrote about his own life. And one wonders what else it contained. When Brutus fled the city, Portia remained. We don't have any of their correspondence, but we can imagine that it existed. Women were their own advocates. They could initiate divorce. They could appear and testify in court. Some women held massive economic power and were in control of independent wealth. Some took part in public religious life and held official religious positions. If Portia was a symbol of republicanism to the extent that she was informed of the plot to assassinate Caesar, it was at least partially because she shaped herself to be so. This period also yields examples of women participating in public and even organizing in group action that kind of goes beyond this idea of behind the scenes participation. And this is a sort of a famous instance in 42. So in 42, Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus, the so-called Second Triumvirate, they needed money. And they passed an edict requiring 1,400 of the richest women in Rome to make a valuation of their property and to portion out parts of it to the state. It was further provided that if they should conceal their property or make any sort of false valuation, then they would be fined. Appian tells us that a group of women organized in protest. And first, they do what good elite women should do. They go to the female relatives of the triumvirs, and we'll hear more about them later. Antony's mother, Julia, his wife, Fulvia, and also Octavian's sister, Octavia. When Fulvia is unwilling to help them, the women elect Hortensia, who's the daughter of a famous orator, Hortensius, to speak for them. And they march into the forum, so into the most public space in Rome, and Hortensia addresses the triumvir. And she says, "As befitting women of our rank, addressing a petition to you, we had recourse to your female relatives. Having suffered unseemly treatment on the part of Fulvia, we've been compelled by her to visit the forum. You have deprived us of our fathers, our sons, our husbands, and our brothers, whom you accused of having wronged you. If you take away our property also, you reduce us to a condition unbecoming of our birth, our manners, our sex. If we have done you wrong, as you say our husbands have, prescribe us as you do them. If we women have not voted you public enemies, have not torn down your houses, destroyed your army, or led another one against you, if we have not hindered you in obtaining offices and honors, why do you visit upon us the same punishment as upon the guilty, whose offenses we have not shared? Why should we pay taxes when we have no part in the honors, the commands, and the statecraft for which you contend against each other with such harmful results?" The triumvirs at first are angry, and they try to drive them away, but there's this uproar in the crowd. And so the men agree to consider their proposal, and in the end, the women win the day, and the triumvirs decide to reduce the number of women from 1,400 to 400 and impose an additional tax on certain categories of men. So this is an example, a sort of par excellence of this female emancipation, and it provides a really rare instance in which the words of a woman were actually preserved. It was, in fact, published and distributed. A few things to note. First of all, these women are not all unified, right? Clearly, for example, Fulvia does not agree to support their efforts to combat the tax. Second, the speech is predicated on the fact that women cannot participate in government, yet here they are, participating. Perhaps it's speeches like this, rhetorical exercises where the line between the political life of men and the political life of women is so starkly drawn, that causes us to so often separate out the actions of women from that of men, to write their political lives in this period as women's history, rather than just as history, integrated into our story of the civil wars. But the primary ways of getting funds for the Second Triumvirate was not the tax of wealthy women. They instituted a series of prescriptions, and this is something Hortensia alluded to in her speech. Prescriptions were death sentences passed on political enemies with the goal of sequestering their wealth and property. Many men fled the city, heading down to join other Romans in exile in Asia, in Africa, in Sicily. We have numerous stories of women who helped to save or hide their husbands, or even, as attested in the funeral oration called the so-called Laudatio Turiae, who funded their flights and publicly advocated on their behalf back in Rome. And these events have been well discussed, most recently and thoroughly in this book, which if you're interested in women and in this period, you should absolutely read by Jonathan Osgood. But for the rest of this talk, I'm going to move away from some of these more famous and more well-discussed stories and show a series of smaller, more fragmentary accounts of women's participation in the tumultuous final years of the Res Publica. Moments where women act as crucial nodes in a communication network, crucial in this period of displacement and mobility. And we will see that they don't just transmit facts and news, but they act as messengers and intermediaries, and even as gatekeepers of information. They give advice on political situations that they are witnessing, analyzing, and negotiating. Most of these stories, like the one I presented at the beginning about Fulvia's letter, preserve glimpses of action without voice, letters without content, or with content clearly invented or guessed by the author. My ongoing project is finding and isolating these messages that women sent, carried, and represented, and placing them in historical context. The findings, while limited, move us beyond some of these more well-discussed moments of women's power in the late Republic and write women back into the story. As the Roman senatorial elite scattered in factional chaos in the last decades of the Republic, women were also on the move, and they played important roles in informing, organizing, directing, and advocating. Some of these maybe fit into the category of behind the scenes, and others do not. To sort of set the scene, I want to look first at a letter of Cicero from 49 BCE. The year begins very dramatically in Rome, where the past few months had been a tense period of waiting to see whether Julius Caesar, who was returning from his campaigns in Gaul, would disband his legions and come down into Italy peacefully, or whether he would march in at the head of an army. On January 11th or so, Caesar crosses the Rubicon River into the kind of separation between Gaul and Italy at the head of a legion. And over the next 2 weeks, Italy flocks to join him. At Rome, the consul, Pompey the Great, and his senatorial supporters, fearing that Caesar's coming bore a death sentence to his political rivals, decide to flee the city. One of these men, of course, was Marcus Tullius Cicero, former consul, famous orator, bane to all beginning Latin students. By the 22nd of January, he was already in the south of Italy at Formia, on the coast between Rome and Naples, and he wrote a letter to his wife and children, Tullius to his wife, and her father to his dearest daughter, and Cicero, his mother and sister, send warm greetings. I think, my darlings, you should carefully consider and reconsider what to do, whether to stay at Rome or join me or seek some place of safety. This is not a point for my consideration alone, but also for yours. What occurs to me is this: you may be safe in Rome under Dolabella's protection, and that circumstance may prove serviceable to us in case of any violence or plunder commencing. But on the other hand, I'm shaken in this idea by seeing that all the loyalists have left Rome and the ladies of their families have gone with them. Again, the district in which I am now consists of towns and estates also, which are in my power. So you could be a good deal with me and if you quitted me, could very conveniently stay in domains belonging to us. I cannot as yet make up my mind which of the two is the better course for you to take. Please observe for yourselves what other ladies of your rank are doing, and be careful not to cut off from the power of leaving town when you wish to do so. I would have you carefully consider again, and with each other and with your friends. Tell Philotimus to secure the house with barricades and a watch. And also please organize a regular service of letter carriers, so that I may hear something from you every day. Above all, attend to your health, if you wish me to maintain mine. Here we see Cicero's internal debate about leaving his family in Rome, and I want to draw your attention to a few things. Cicero indicates that Dolabella, his daughter's husband and staunch Caesarian, can provide protection for his family, even though they're the family of Cicero who's fled. Second, that while many of the fleeing senators brought their families, others clearly seem to have left them in Rome. Third, there's no assumption that these women will be out of contact with their networks, particularly the other women of elite houses. It's assumed they can and will keep their ears to the ground about the political situation in Rome and understand the ramifications for their own safety. Lastly, they're urged to set up a regular letter service. And if they do as they ask, they will be in contact with Cicero every day. And I should say, we absolutely do not have a record of daily letters between Cicero and his family in this period, though that would be a wonderful thing to have. So it can show us the many, many gaps in this record, right? What might those letters show us? Cicero's situation is not unusual for the time, though the volume of displacement in these decades certainly was. In the first days of displacement and fracturing of the senatorial class in 49, we get a sense for the role that women might play as go-betweens in politically split families, as trustworthy observers left behind in Rome, with access to their own networks of information and their own safety nets, and as sources for information for those who fled to far corners of the empire. We also see how they could act as protectors of their own interests and of those of their friends and family. You don't have to memorize this or anything. But for the rest of this talk, I'm going to take you through a series of case studies where we see women performing this role. And I want to focus on the subsequent major period of movement and displacement of the senatorial elite. So back to this so-called triumval period, roughly about a 5-year period, I would say, from the death of Caesar in 44 to the Treaty of Misenum in 39. And this takes us through the complex frenemyship between the main players in the aftermath of Caesar's murder, the so-called tyrannicides, Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's two successors, one legal, his nephew Octavian, and one more ideological, his right-hand man, Marcus Antonius, and then the youngest son of Pompey, Sextus, who leads his own maritime rebel faction on the coasts of Sicily. These men and their followers alternately come to peace and fight against each other in Gaul, in Africa, in Spain, in Sicily, in the East. There are letters, as we have already seen before and after this period, but for the sake of time, and because frankly, this is where the evidence packs a real punch, we're going to focus on these 5 years or so. The sources for this period that I use, or that we can use in order to see the lives of women, are mainly literary. There are other important sources for this period, particularly coins, but this is just not somewhere, unfortunately, that we can see women at all. And I focus on, these literary sources are important, but they focus on the lives of just a few key players. So thus, the most visible women to us are the sisters, wives, mothers, daughters, and friends of Rome's most important political actors. So our literary sources include the kind of overarching accounts of the period from Cassius Dio and Appian, both written subsequently. Plutarch's lives, also at a great distance from the actual events of some of the major players, Caesar, Pompey, Cato, Brutus, Cicero, Antony. The summary of the lost books of Livy, which give us very little, and of course the extensive writings of Cicero. So let's begin in 44, a few days after the death of Caesar on the Ides of March. And our story revolves around one Attia, the niece of Julius Caesar, mother of a son, Octavian, by her husband, Octavius, remarried to one Philippus, who had been the consul 2 years prior, a very important man. When Caesar was killed, his will posthumously adopted Octavian, the son of his niece Attia. Octavian was at the time 19 years old and studying in Apollonia, a Greek university town in what is now southern Albania. And Octavian heard about the death and his adoption. He considered his options, and he came to Italy via the port of Brundisium. This story is told, in short, everywhere. Every account, no matter how short, of the Civil War tells us this story. But if we look at two authors in particular, Appian and Nicholas of Damascus, we get a more complex account, which goes something like this. As soon as the news reaches Octavian of Caesar's death in Apollonia, he receives a letter from his mother and his stepfather. And Appian says, his mother and stepfather Philippus wrote to him from Rome not to be too confident and not to attempt anything rash, but to bear in mind that what Caesar, after conquering every enemy, had suffered at the hands of his closest friends, and that it would be safer under present circumstances to choose a private life and hasten to them at Rome, but with caution. Nicholas of Damascus gives another version that places Attia at the center. He says a freedman came from home in excitement and dismay, sent by his mother, and carrying a letter which said that Caesar had been killed in the Senate by Cassius and Brutus and their accomplices. She asked her son to return to her, as she didn't know what the outcome of affairs would be. She said he must show himself a man now and consider what he ought to do and put his plans in action according to fortune and opportunity. His mother's letter made all this clear, and the man who brought it gave a similar report. In both these versions, Attia writes to her son. In one letter with her husband, we see her urging caution. In the second letter, seemingly without her husband, though of course this is the same letter, right? Two versions of the same letter. She carefully urges him to present his options, urges him to come home, and to consider the situation. So Octavian heads to Lupii, modern Lecce, to hide out for a while, where he receives more details of the situation in the city of Rome. Even though he's received details as soon as he arrives in Lecce, he nonetheless waits for other letters from his mother and his friends in Rome, although he did not disbelieve those who had reported the events, for he saw no reason why they should fabricate any falsehood. So we see that at each step, he's relying on his mother to keep him updated on the rapidly changing situation on the ground, and relying on her as having the most up-to-date and the most, let's say, truthful information. Before setting sail for the main port of Italy in Brindisi, where an army of Caesarians is there to meet him, he takes his newly adopted father's name, Caesar, and heads to Rome, where he'll confront Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, who, immediately following Caesar's death, had set himself up as Caesar's natural successor. But first, Octavian goes directly to his mother. And Attia checked his speaking and encouraged him to prosecute his designs with the favor of fortune. She advised him, however, to use art and patience rather than open boldness. He agrees, and he heads to the house of Antony, where he proceeds to give a long and practiced speech. Nicholas Damascus then gives more details on Attia's position. When she saw the glory of fortune and the extent of the empire devolving upon her own son, she rejoiced. But on the other hand, knowing that the undertaking was full of fear and danger, and having seen what happened to her uncle Caesar, she was not very enthusiastic. So it looked as though she was between the view of her husband Philippus and that of her son. Hence, she felt many cares, now anxious when she enumerated all the dangers awaiting one striving for supreme power, and now elated when she thought of the extent of that power and honor. Therefore, she did not dare to dissuade her son from attempting the great deed and effecting a just requital. But still, she did not venture to urge him on, because fortune seemed somewhat obscure. She permitted his use of the name Caesar, and in fact was the first to assent. In the innumerable accounts of Octavian's journey from Apollonia to Rome, the role of his mother Attia is hardly ever mentioned. But what we see in these accounts, and especially here, is that she was a major source of information on the insider political situation in Rome. She is sending up-to-date and rapid news. She acts as an informed advisor in one of the most tense political situations Rome has ever seen. When her son arrives, she coaches him on what to say and how to say it when he meets Mark Antony, which implies a deep knowledge of politics, the political landscape of Mark Antony, and also maybe of the skill of rhetoric, right? And the skill of actually speaking and composing a speech. And she seems to have been some deciding factor in whether or not he began to use the name Caesar and the extent to which he embraced this posthumous adoption. The next year and a half between March of 44 and November of 43 was one of great activity, to say the least. There's an uneasy peace held between the assassins of Caesar, led by Brutus, Marcus Junius Brutus, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, Antony and Octavian, but it's soon broken. By late summer of 44, Brutus and Cassius have left Rome. Antony is upset with his military assignment given to him by the Senate, and so he heads to Cisalpine Gaul, where he lays siege to an army of one of the other tyrannicides, confusingly also named Brutus, Decimus Brutus. By the winter, through the efforts of Octavian and Cicero, Antony has been declared a public enemy in Rome. In January of 43, Octavian is given a special command and sent to meet Antony in battle. By November 43, when Octavian and Antony reconcile and form, along with Lepidus, the second triumvirate, and decide to hold the prescriptions, and recall these are death sentences for political rivals. Prescribed men, depending on their connections and political leanings, have many options on where to flee, and they scatter to join the remnants of the supporters of the tyrannicides who are flung widely throughout the Roman world. It's a time of rapidly shifting allegiances. And our next story centers on Servilia, sister of Cato, our staunch Republican who's afraid of the Republic becoming a matrimonial agency, wife of two members of the gens Julia, Junius Silanus, two different branches of the gens Julia, Junius Silanus, with whom she had 3 daughters, and Junius Brutus, with whom she had 1 son. Member by birth of the Servili Capiones, who had given a powerful series of consuls to the Republic. So powerful a family did she come from that her son Brutus would actually get himself adopted into it, so that he could take the name of his mother's family along with that of his father, and would be known as Quintus Servilius Caepio Brutus, which is a real testament to the power of her and her family. In June of 44, a few months after Caesar's assassination, when it seems that the amnesty that's originally given to the assassins will not hold, Brutus and Cassius are considering fleeing. And there's a sort of famous incident in this period, much discussed in the scholarship on women's power, and that's this family council, concilium, held by the Unii, the family of Brutus, at Antium. And Cicero was present, so we learn about it from his letters. And it's kind of long, but I think it's worth reading the whole thing. I reached Antium before midday, and Brutus was very glad to see me. And there, in the presence of Servilia, Tertulla, also called Tertia, and Portia, and a lot of others, he asked me for my opinion. Favonius was present too. I had made my mind up on the journey and advised him to accept the control of the corn supply of Asia. This is what the Senate had assigned him and Cassius to do to sort of get them out of the city, get them out of the way. There was nothing else for us to do now except keep him out of danger. By doing so, we should have some safeguard for the Republic too. And when I was in the midst of my speech, in came Cassius. I said the same over again, when Cassius, with eyes flashing and fairly breathing war, declared he would not go to Sicily. Am I to take an insult like a favor? What will you do then? I asked. And he said that he would go to Achaia. What of you, Brutus? I said. To Rome, he answered, if you think I ought. I don't think so at all, I said, for you won't be safe. Well, if it were possible to be there in safety, would you approve? Yes. I would rather you didn't go to a province now or after your praetorship, but I don't advise you to trust yourself in Rome. And I gave him all the reasons that will occur to you why it would not be safe. He's writing to his friend Atticus here. And they kept on bewailing the chances they'd let slip, especially Cassius. And they complained bitterly of Decimus Brutus. I said they ought not to harp on the past, but I agreed with them. I went on to explain what ought to have been done, saying nothing new, but what everyone's saying daily, and not touching on the point as to whether anyone else ought to have been attacked, that is, anyone else beyond Caesar. When I said they should have called the Senate, they should have roused the people to action with greater vigor, they should have taken on over the whole conduct of affairs, your friend Servilia explained, well, I've never heard the like. After that, I kept quiet. But I think Cassius will go, for Servilia promises she will see that the appointment to the corn supply will be withdrawn from the senatorial decree. And our friend soon gave up on his silly talk of wanting to go to Rome. So he's made up his mind that the games may be held in his absence under his name. We learn here many things. Number one, the inclusion of women in such discussions. We know that Portia had even been privy to the conspiracy to kill Caesar. She's clearly still in the inner circle. We learn that Servilia, Brutus's mother, has played a crucial role in the composition of strategy in the months after Caesar's death. Here she's disagreeing with Cicero's Monday morning quarterbacking about what should have happened after the assassination of Caesar. And most interesting for us, we learn of a promise for Servilia to act as a messenger and advocate once her son, dissuaded from remaining in Rome, along with Cassius, leaves, she herself will see to it to change a senatorial decree regarding the grain supply. And this is not the only instance where we see Servilia acting as a sort of a fulcrum in the Roman political scene. In October of the same year, Cicero writes to Atticus, who claims to know nothing about Brutus, who at this point is likely en route to Macedon with his army. Never to fear, reassures Cicero. Servilia says that Marcus Scaptius has arrived, and that he will pay her a secret visit at her house without any parade, and that I shall know everything. Meanwhile, she also tells me that a slave of Bassus has arrived to announce that the legions at Alexandria are in arms, that Bassus is being summoned. Cassius's arrival is looked for with eagerness. In short, the Republic seems about to recover its legitimate authority. Little does he know. Servilia here is clearly a focal point, a vital node in a network of fast-flying information at a time when loyalties change fast. Even more than that, she's a gatekeeper of information. Even Cicero, one of the most well-connected political men of his age, relies on Servilia for news of Brutus. And not just her son, but her son-in-law, Cassius, as he heads towards the troops stationed in Syria. In July of 43, Cicero writes to Brutus in Macedonia and indicates that he had been summoned by Servilia to another family council. On my arrival, I found Casca, Labeo, and Scaptius there. Well, she opened the subject and asked my opinion, whether or not we should ask you to come to Italy, and whether we thought it to your advantage, or whether it would be better if you put it off and stayed where you were. I answered, as was my real opinion, that it was of the highest advantage to your position and reputation to bring help at the first possible moment to the tottering and almost prostrate republic. Clearly, Brutus is placing such faith in Servilia and her politicking at Rome that she feels she can sway whether or not he returns to the city. This is from a letter between Cicero and Brutus. They're in contact. Brutus can just ask Cicero directly for his advice, and indeed in other letters he does, and they fight about it. Instead, what we see here is Servilia gathering information, and perhaps even, at least in her mind, seems to think she can make the final decision. Similarly, here we have an attestation of the Brutus Paula, who's writing to Cicero in January of 43, asking if he has anything he wants to send to Brutus up in Gaul, where he's besieged by Mark Antony. So we can see that these women have another, maybe closer or more frequent level of communication. They're acting as personal mediators, even between men who are regularly in contact. More than that, their opinions matter. At times when alliances shift rapidly, women are guarding information. They're deciding what to share, when, and with whom. In the end, Brutus would not return. A month later, Octavian passed a law in the Senate, the Lex Padia, making the murder of a dictator retroactively illegal. Brutus remained with his legions in the east, and a year later he would be dead, along with Cassius, defeated by Octavian and Antony at Philippi. These are not the only letters, but you can see others here, attested letters from Servilia and sometimes her daughter, Tertia, to Brutus, Cassius, and to Cicero, especially regarding the difficult position of the family because Brutus's sister is married to Lepidus and has sons that Brutus, Cicero, and Servilia are eager to protect. So we talked about, I think, 2 of these, and there's 2 up here that we haven't talked about. So now we move ahead a few years and focus. We come back to Fulvia, wife of 3 influential politicians, but for our concerns, Mark Antony, daughter of a member of the gens Servilia and Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, perhaps the last of her gens, and heir to a massive fortune. She married Marcus Antonius, her 3rd husband, in 47, and she bore him 2 children. In 42, Antony and Octavian, who had had a falling out, make peace. They divide the empire between themselves and Lepidus. Antony heads east, where he would take up with Cleopatra, the context in which this talk began. So while Antony's away, he leaves his brother Lucius in charge of his interests at Rome. So great was the influence of his wife in this period, however, that Cassius Dio begins his description of the year 41 with the following words. The following year, Publius Servilius and Lucius Antonius nominally became consuls, but in reality, it was Antonius and Fulvia. In 41, Fulvia and Lucius make war on Octavian at Perugia, modern Perugia. Appian tells us the conflict between Lucius and Octavian was incited by a jealous Fulvia who hoped it would lure Antony out of the arms of Cleopatra and back to Italy. We, of course, already discussed this letter full of lamentations to her husband, but it's hardly the only attested communication. When Lucius and Octavian first fall out, Fulvia heads to Rome from Praeneste, with hopes that she and her children might seek protection from Lepidus, who at that point is in control of the city. And Appian says, Fulvia went there to meet Lepidus, saying now that she had fears for her children. She used him for a pretext this time instead of Octavian. Both of them, her and Lucius, wrote these things to Antony, and friends were sent to him with the letters, who were to give him particulars about each complaint. And though I have searched, I have not been able to find any clear account of what Antony wrote in reply. We'll notice here he also gives no clear account at what Fulvia and Lucius wrote. The implication is that Fulvia wrote to her husband about her fears for her children, but in reality, we see no real content here. Fulvia's letters placed alongside that of Lucius, and so all we see is her keeping in close contact with Antony as the situation in Italy evolves. Her displacement to Rome, although it's difficult to track her movements in this period, doesn't seem to have hindered her enthusiasm for the defense of her husband's interests. Appian again attests to her sending messages to Antonine supporters, urging the generals Ventidius, Asinius, Ateus, and Calenus to abandon Gaul and hasten to Italy to fight for Antony in Perugia. This is the second one up here. Cassius Dio has her, quote, sending orders both inside and outside of the Perusine War. In the winter of 40, Cassius Dio even tells us that Fulvia sent a letter to Titus Sextius, who's a supporter of Antony. Complicated story short, a supporter of Antony who had been sent to Africa to depose the proscribed Quintus Cornificius and was later replaced by an Octavian supporter, Gaius Fuvius Fango. And apparently Fulvia instructs him to overthrow Fango and recover Africa for Antony. Of course, Fulvia in some ways is a unique case. We have no other records of women playing such an active role in military affairs, at least from this period. She was, in fact, so infamous that she survives in the literary and historical imagination as a sort of mythical monster. She behaved in a way so contrary to the expectations of Roman society that Velleius Patroclus wrote that she had, quote, nothing of the woman about her except her body. At the news of her death in the winter of 40, I'm hesitating to quote Shakespeare here in case the lights go off, but Shakespeare's Cleopatra asks in apparent disbelief, can Fulvia die? We cannot know what Cicero, who passionately hated Antony and his wife, would have preserved of Fulvia's actions. He had been proscribed and killed in November of 43 and didn't live to see them. The last case I want to look at involves Julia, a member of the Julii family, as we can tell from her name, through her father, Lucius Julius Caesar, consul of 90, and thus herself a distant cousin of the famous Gaius Julius Caesar. She was married first to Marcus Antoninus Creticus, with whom she produced the three Antoni, Gaius, Lucius, and our friend Marcus. She was quite active in Rome. She, along with her daughter-in-law Fulvia, went door to door in the winter of 44, trying to dissuade the Senate from voting her son Antony a public enemy. Later, she publicly defies that same son by refusing to turn over her brother, who was condemned in the prescriptions. And yes, for those who are following, this does mean that Antony prescribed his own uncle. But we also see her traveling the Mediterranean and negotiating outside of her own immediate family. We're in the winter of 40 BC now, a short while before Fulvia's death in Greece. When Fulvia had left in the wake of the Perusine War to meet Antony in Greece, Julia went down to Sicily to meet up with Sextus Pompey, the youngest son of Pompey the Great, who had set himself up with this sort of alternative Rome in exile on the waves and hosted a number of exiled senators. In the wake of Octavian's victory at Perugia, some of the opposition joined him, but others fled. And so a new wave of senatorial refugees descended on Sextus Pompey in Sicily, who were, of course, formerly his enemies because they were supporters of Antony. Cassius Dio here implies that Julia went first, though it's unclear why, perhaps to act as an ambassador for the newly contrite senatorial elite headed down to Sicily. Either way, the way it unfolds seemed to eliminate the possibility that her son, Antony, asked her to go. She seems to have gone on her own volition. Perhaps with Fulvia having failed against Octavian at Perugia, Julia, the other protector of her son's interests, and clearly someone who's closely in communication with Fulvia, as we saw in the situation from 44, thought the best plan would be to head south with Antony's generals and secure the support of Sextus Pompey. Cassius Dio tells us, many of the foremost men made their way, partly to him, Octavian, and partly to Sextus in Sicily. Julia, the mother of the Antoni, went there first and was received by Sextus with extreme kindness. Later, she was sent by him to her son Marcus, carrying proposals of friendship and taking along envoys. Not to malign Syme again, but when Syme, the Roman Revolution, discusses this incident, he says that Sextus sent envoys to Antony, and in a footnote, he names the male envoys and says that they brought along Julia, which is exactly the opposite of the way that this is presented in our ancient sources. This period of later, when she's sent to Marcus, is detailed by Appian, who tells us that Julia then joins Antony and Fulvia in Greece, having been sent as an envoy by Pompeius with some of the members of his faction, Lucius Libo and Saturninus. The idea was to make peace with Antony and convince him to join an alliance against Octavian. Julia, I'll let you read that. Julia is clearly central to the communication of these main players. Later, when Octavian is fighting with Antony at Brundisium, he's reluctant to write to Antony, and he writes instead to Julia. At the same time, she's in correspondence with Octavian's host and Antony's supporter, Marcus Coccea Nerva, a distant ancestor of the later Emperor Nerva. These two seem to be working together towards bringing Antony and Octavian towards reconciliation, which then happens at Brundisium in September of 40, when Mark Antony marries Octavian's sister Octavia. So we can see here through Julia's movements as a messenger, through her correspondence, this crucial role she's playing in negotiating a peace, however short-lived, between Octavian, Antony, and Sextus Pompey. When the three of them meet together in Misenum in 39, Appian even tells us that Julia is there, although some think that here she's confused with Pompeia, Pompey's sister, or Scribonia, his mother, who are also known to be with him in Sicily. And also present is Sextus's mother, Mucia, daughter of Quintus Mucius Scaevola, consul of 95, and one of the wives of Pompey the Great. Mucia had been sent as an envoy, we hear, by the people of Rome, though some stories tell her that Octavian sent her, to negotiate with her son in person because his frequent raids on the coast are causing famine in the city. So where does this leave us? Well, first in 39 BCE, a strange midpoint, and not at all at the end of the civil wars. But I hope to have shown some of the potential of this project and how it can take us a long way towards reintegrating women, not just as a small group of unusually visible individuals, back into the political history of the last century of the Republic. It's long been acknowledged, as I said at the beginning, that the dearth of men and the political strife of this period spurred more women into visible public action. But I hope also to have shown that this is a bit too simplistic. We have very few primary sources for the periods before the 1st century BCE. That is, most of them were written many centuries later. And the sudden visibility of women here, to my mind, also correlates with an influx of visibility in the detailed lives of men. The necessity of the development of a complex and sometimes secretive communication network brings the power and influence that women, in some ways, always held behind the scenes into, if not public view, somewhere between the public demonstration in the Forum of 42 and the sort of backroom conversations that women have been credited with throughout Roman Republican history. Thanks to the letters of Cicero, we have far more information about the Civil War than any other period in Roman history. We know about the family of Brutus because Cicero preserves a book of letters to Brutus, and because Brutus himself once wrote a book about his life. What references might we have if Cicero had been alive during the Perusine War? We must also remember that all of our sources, letters of Cicero included, were written very carefully in a dangerous time. Many of the later histories, such as Appian and Cassius Dio, are being produced in a world in which history was shaped by the victor. There are whole accounts of the civil wars that were erased by Augustus and his successors. Selective memories, such as that of the role of Attia in shaping the political life of young Octavian, or the vitriol against Fulvia that seems to run across the board, are perhaps casualties of Augustus's careful refashioning of his story in the wake of an autocratic takeover. I say these things to make it clear that this is not a woman's history necessarily. Many of the women here played the same roles as men. They knew the political landscape and its history intimately. In Roman Republican politics, separating the political and personal is impossible. It's impossible for any story. And so why do we relegate women to the personal and men to the political? This is a history in which women, along with men, were intimately involved in the politics of power. It's a history of war, of shifting alliances, of subterfuge. The years of violence transition from an oligarchic republic to an autocracy, over the course of which history was rewritten selectively. And many open questions remain. The list I presented tonight is far from complete, even for these 5 years. There are many more that I've found. But I hope to have shown, however, that we should agree with Syme that women do have their uses for historians. Thank you very much for your time. Let's stay up here.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Emily, for that really wonderful and stimulating talk. There will be a roving microphone that goes around the room for questions, and likewise to our online audience. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat. I think you make the convincing case that to read women in late Republican politics, we should just read late Republican politics. And the two, in the examples you bring up, they're completely inseparable, and perhaps that rather than women have been written out, it's just we haven't read what's been written particularly carefully. Open up to the floor for questions.
Hi, sorry if this is a bit of an unfair question because you said you didn't want to address this, but I was really struck by the first 2 images that you had of women in like 16th century paintings and just how evocative that visual element and how violent it is. And I wonder whether, I guess my first question is, do you think that comes out of the sort of academic marginalization you're talking about with Syme? Is that a product of our own fascination with these women in a apolitical or political sense? And then I guess bringing it back to the ancient world, if you had any opinions on how that relates to the appearance of women in the visual sphere, because obviously, as you say, it's minimal, but there is a suggestion that there's this coin that may depict Fulvia or maybe victory. And whether you have opinions on that debate and whether aligning with goddesses, how that fits into it, whether it's different to what we see here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. You know, I'm going to say that I know nothing about these paintings. I'm going to start off with that. I am in no way an expert in any sort of art, you know, after, say, the 2nd century CE. And even then, I think we're on shaky ground. But, you know, what I think is very interesting is the way in which these women, including Cleopatra, like I'm thinking of Waterhouse, and all these women have been sort of memorialized in culture. And I think the Shakespeare quotes that I read as well kind of are very similar in this way, have been really interested in these sort of stories of women that are, at the end of the day, these literary topoi. And if any of you have read maybe Livy, we can think about the death of Lucretia and the sort of her suicide. That sort of is a way that women's chastity and women's good behavior is linked to sort of the success of the state. This is what a good woman should be doing. And there's also a sort of similar set of topoi about what bad women do. And we have these also from very early stories, you know, from the Tarquin family, for example, in the early Republic. And these are stories, these sort of emblematic exempla that we get in Roman history so often that have so fascinated artists, I think, across time. And so this is actually, you know, we get this story about Fulvia, when Cicero is prescribed. There's this story that his head is brought to her in Mark Antony, and she starts sticking her hairpins in it, right? And it's interesting to me that this is what has so captured people about her, this sort of evil witchiness. And I think it's because it's the sort of way in which women are always portrayed. It's an interesting story, right? It's a way of thinking about women's power that I think has been very effective and has stuck to them in antiquity and sort of continued with the way they've been thought about ever since. As to, you know, art at the time, it's really interesting. We have very few images of women in the Republic. This is much more, I think, a product, or at least what we have that remains the product of the imperial period, in which we see very different kinds of roles for women. This is in some ways a transition period, right? And we see sort of at the end of this period, a series of women who make this incredible transition from being the matronae of the late Republic to being empresses, basically, to being part of the royal house. And this includes people like Octavia, who's the only woman in all of antiquity, basically, that nothing bad is ever said about, speaking of rewritings of history by Augustus, and Livia, who actually spent the entirety of this period running away from Augustus with her husband on the run because her husband was proscribed, and then ends up marrying him, right? And becomes this sort of first empress or first queen in some ways in Rome. So I think, I don't really know where to read these women in that sort of visual record, because we don't see that portrayal. And this coin with Fulvia's victory, I'm going to say I'm not super convinced by it. There's only one of them. It's from Smyrna or something. It's from way out in one of the provinces in Asia. I think really probably the first woman we see on a coin is Octavia, who's very much a symbol of this sort of, she's very much used symbolically by Antony and Octavius in their sort of fight. So I'm not sure that answered any of your questions, but if it didn't, take the mic up again.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk. And I have a question about the male-authored nature of the literary sources we're dealing with, and especially concerning your preoccupation about the lack of content of the letters that these women have probably written. And in particular, I'm wondering whether even if we add a content of these letters, how can we reconcile the male-authored nature of this text with the impersonation of female voices by male authors? And in particular, I'm asking this because I'm looking at Pompeian graffiti written in a female voice, and the scholarly debate there is that even if we have like a female name or an erotic poem written with female adjectival forms, for example, we are confronting with a text that is authored by a man. And there's, of course, a lot of like critical bias that needs to be redressed there. And I was also wondering whether you have considered as a point of reference Ovid's Heroides, in which you definitely have a literary game there, and you have the content of female authored letters. Well, they're not female authors. They are in a female voice, but they are impersonated by a man. And there's a lot there. I'm sorry if the question is not super clear, but thanks.
No, that's a great question. Thank you. And, you know, I think it's one of the kind of strange paradoxes of antiquity, and I'm talking sort of broad scale, both maybe Greek and Roman antiquity at least, is that there's a sort of idea, or that's also real, that women had a very sort of limited voice, and especially if we're thinking about, you know, maybe Athens or something, in classical Athens, that they have to sort of stay in the house. And then we get these incredible characters like Medea, right? Or like the way Ovid is writing, that sort of present these strong women who talk in a way that really resonates even today about sort of women's issues, and really calls out certain parts of the hypocrisy of women's lives in antiquity and what they're sort of barred from, and yet what they have to sort of undergo. And you know, I don't really know what to do with that. And when I teach, for example, women in, for example, Greece, this is one of the things I ask: how can we have Euripides writing this speech of Medea, and then also think that women just had to stay in the house and were living separate lives? I don't know how to reconcile that. But I think what's interesting about these cases, or what I've sort of decided to do with these cases, is, as I said, this idea of jealousy, I just decided to ignore it. And maybe that's not scholarly, maybe that's not the right thing to do, but I just don't think, I don't think I would, well, I know I wouldn't. If this was a letter from a man and they said, oh, he was jealous, I wouldn't take that seriously as a historian. How does this author know how the person was feeling? I mean, unless we have some reference that's very clear, you know, with some letter that's actually quoted, you know, I think I wouldn't take that very seriously. So that part I've sort of decided to ignore. And the parts of the letters that, you know, have content, I mean, this is the whole debate over the letter of Cornelia, right? The mother of the Gracchi. Is this actually from her? Or is this sort of a letter, in which case she's a very strong political actor? Or is this a sort of letter that's invented recently? I think all I did was rephrase your question, but I think it's a great question because it's not an easy one to do. But I think what I'm doing here is saying, okay, we can't get the content back. But if we look at them, if we rewrite this and we just say, for example, and at this point, you know, this is what Antony was doing in Alexandria. And instead of just saying he then made his move and came back to Italy, we say, then his wife wrote him a letter and he came back. I mean, even that is a massive change in the way we think about those dynamics, right? Even if we don't have the content.
Firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much for your talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You brought up earlier in answering Amelie's question exactly where I was about to head, which was the exemplar, the semi-mythical women of early Rome. And I've always found studying these women that there's a distinct dichotomy. They are simultaneously praised, people like Cloelia, Vitruria, Volumnia, praised for their proactiveness, engaging and taking sort of the lead in their stories, but they're also never quite praised with the same vocabulary as men.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, when it comes to these women, like Fulvia, are similar attitudes taken? Obviously, Livy is Augustan. It's not far off. Are these sort of things where they're simultaneously praised for their role, but never quite in the same manner?
That's a great question. One of the things I noticed about, except for the case of Fulvia, who everyone loves to hate in these sources, almost always these women have no comment whatsoever. And this is another reason I think these letters are really interesting historically, because there's no praise or not praise for their action almost ever, right? It's Servilia did this, Servilia didn't do this, or Julia was sent. It doesn't say Julia was sent and like a good mother, you know, in all her modesty, it doesn't say anything like that, right? And most of the sources don't. I don't think, except again for the case of Fulvia, which I think is really an Augustan, in some ways a stamp of Augustan severe disapproval on the entirety of her memory. I think that there's just not a lot of that in these accounts, which makes it really interesting, right? Because in some ways we're seeing just sort of bare bones facts, which goes along with the fact that most of these letters don't have any content, right? They're not making a comment on it at all. And then this person's, which is why I think, again, not thinking of this so much as women's history, but just as a bigger vision of the political landscape is sort of the way to approach it.
How does that perhaps tie in with funerary inscriptions in thinking about the type of language that's used? And you think typically of dutiful or loving, do you ever get cunning or wily, but also the lack of comment, and trying to bring this back maybe to the topography of Rome, and you think of Caecilian Metella's funerary monument, the largest surviving one on the Appia. And there's no indication that anyone other than her perhaps builds it. In your case, you would be making the case, no, she's an actor and this is her tomb. And there's no comment on her qualities or anything at all. It's just simply Caecilian Metella and then her family.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I think there's a lot of sort of comparative work to be done there. And I think this is another, this is another big debate. Is it Caecilian Metella? Did she put it up or did someone else put it up for her? And I almost think it doesn't matter. When we're thinking of her and integrating her into the history sort of this period and thinking of her, whether she made such an impression and she was such a symbol that this funeral monument was important, or whether she with her own money built it and put it up herself. For this, does that matter? So, I mean, it matters for certain questions. I'm not sure for this question, it matters necessarily. I don't know. Maybe it does.
Yeah, can we just check online? Okay, we have two questions from our online audience. So Leah Mitchell asks, to what extent might these kinds of women's networks have involved non-elite women, and in what capacities?
Right, and this is the eternal question. But I'm sure they did, right? Though at the end of the day, this is a story mostly about, in some ways, it's a story about the political elite because it's a political story. It's the men who are prescribed, they're members of the senatorial elite, the people who are moving around with people with massive wealth, they're members of the senatorial elite or knights with huge amounts of money. And these are the people who are going down and joining factions. That, of course, said, there are a ton of soldiers everywhere who are fighting for these people, right? This is a movement of displacement for all sorts of people at all levels of society. I'm just not sure how necessarily we can see that already just with elite women, as I said at the beginning. If we look at these, if we can identify individuals in this 10-year period, let's say from the death of Caesar to the Battle of Actium, 15 years, we can identify 4,000 men. We can only identify 200 women, and those women are overwhelmingly wives, sisters, daughters of the sort of principal characters who have biographies written about them, in Plutarch and things like this. The one place to look that's sort of interesting, and I haven't really done this carefully, would be accounts of, there's a sort of long account of the prescriptions and women sort of smuggling out their husbands or saving their husbands. And I would imagine we definitely see enslaved men who are a part of that process. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are records also of enslaved women. Of course, there's all sorts of these women, these elite women have, enslaved members of their household that are living with them, that are traveling with them. So I can absolutely imagine a role as message carriers, like we saw, for example, Servilia. Well, I don't know how to do this. And I think I can't do it with the chat. It doesn't matter. We saw this example we saw numerous times freedmen or slaves who are coming and delivering letters, right? Those are probably men who are doing that kind of work, but we can definitely postulate a role of women as well. It's just very, I think, very hard to see.
And then what should probably be our final question, as well, as we've held Emily hostage long enough, but is from Kelsey Madden. Thank you, Emily, for the fantastic talk. In terms of the current status of your project, have you identified additional common themes in their correspondence that you did not have time to address in your presentation? Just a small question from Kelsey. Please.
Yeah.
So what haven't you looked at?
Thanks, Kelsey. I told her to ask me who won the Civil Wars. That's kind of a lowball question, but she asked me this one. Additional common themes. I think, one of the things I kind of don't know how to think about in terms of presenting these letters and presenting women as politicians and the way I think they are actually behaving is the fact that so many of these letters are about protecting family and the sort of family dynamics. So, in Servilia's case, for example, the letters that I didn't go over are mostly about her being concerned about her grandsons and sort of how to protect them and kind of dealing with Cicero and asking for him to stand up for them in the Senate. And I kind of shy away from it in some ways because I think it sort of feeds into this idea that women are only doing things to sort of protect their families. But I mean, of course, they're doing things to protect their families. Men are also doing things to protect their families. But so I'm not really sure how it sort of fits in terms of the sort of political story that I'm trying to tell. That said, as I said at the end, I think the political and the personal are so intertwined in every level of Roman Republican politics that I shouldn't shy away from that, right? But I think that's the main sort of common theme that comes out, not just, their sons and their brothers and things like this, but also their sort of grandsons, and the way that cuts across political ties in some ways that can be very problematic. And we see women both sort of doing this in a problematic way in ways that are difficult for the family, right? Like Julia protecting her brother against the prescriptions of her son, but also in ways that I think is sort of helpful for the family, right? That allows sort of political alliances to be drawn when normally they maybe wouldn't have been, or these relationships would have been more vitriolic. So I think that's something, a thread that I kind of have been seeing running through a lot of these.
Okay, thank you, Emily. And thank you to our audience here in a talk that I think has proven that perhaps the screenwriters for HBO Rome have a better understanding of certain elements of politics than Ronald Syme, which is quite a remarkable achievement.
It's amazing.
Exactly. I'd like to thank everyone here and invite everyone upstairs for a glass of Prosecco. But before we go, can we please thank Emily once again?